Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. Within 3 weeks after the attacks of 9/11, a U.S.-led coalition invaded Afghanistan. By November the 12th, the Taliban regime had been driven from power in Kabul, and in its place, an interim regime headed by Hamid Karzai was installed. After being driven from power in Kabul, the Taliban mounted an insurgency that has lasted to this day. In March of 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq. By April 14th, Saddam Hussein had been driven from power in Baghdad. What emerged in the aftermath of that was a largely Sunni-based insurgency that has persisted also until today. Despite all our efforts at building democracy in these two nations, both wars have continued to rage for 10 years. These are now the two longest-lasting wars in U.S. history. Over 100,000 Iraqis have been killed. Almost 4,800 U.S. troops have been killed. 32,000 plus have been wounded. Over 1,700 U.S. troops have been killed in Afghanistan, 2,700 almost between U.S. and coalition partners, 13,000 wounded. Over 8,500 Afghan troops have been killed and over 8,800 Afghan civilians. My purpose in the time I have left is not to rehash the conduct of these wars or the motivations or justifications for them. There's certainly much to be debated on these points, but nothing I could say in the next 8 minutes would resolve those matters. So instead, I'm going to focus on the future. What are the prospects for these wars coming to an end anytime soon, and what are the likely outcomes of these wars? Second, if and when they do end, what are the prospects for post-war Iraq and Afghanistan? Public debate over these two wars is focused on two main options. First, a surge in troops. Should we increase the number of troops in order to achieve victory over the insurgents? Or alternatively, should we withdraw U.S. troops in order to avoid casualties, reduce the cost of war, and compel the local armies in both Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan to stand up as U.S. forces stand down? Well, what I'd like to discuss is what are the two likely outcomes of these options, and what's the basis of my arguments on this? Well, we have 2 decades of peace science research on how civil conflicts end, and this research provides us with some insights into what the likely outcomes of these wars. A lot of this research is being done by my colleagues here at the University of North Texas at the Castleberry Peace Institute. So what does this research suggest? After 10 years of war in Afghanistan and 8 years of war in Iraq, first of all, the troop surge by itself is unlikely to produce the sort of decisive military victory that would bring a durable peace to either nation. On the other hand, a withdrawal of U.S. forces by itself may reduce U.S. losses, but it will leave in its wake, in both cases, a weakened regime in grave peril of state failure and facing an emboldened insurgency. In both cases, these risks are exacerbated by sectarian, regional, and ethnic divisions in society and weak government institutions. In both cases, the fragility of the regime is exacerbated by the fact that both are relatively young regimes. Both regimes were born out of war, and both were installed in place as a result of foreign invasion. One thing I think we have pretty solid findings on in peace science research is that young regimes, born of war, installed by foreign powers, and still plagued by civil conflict that gave birth to them, are even more likely to fail than equally weak regimes that were homegrown. So what then does our research tell us about how these wars are likely to end? And what is the prospect for a durable peace in Iraq and Afghanistan after the war's end? Well, one finding that's fairly robust and fairly consistent is that the longer a civil war lasts, the less likely it is that either side, the government or the rebels, will achieve decisive military victory. When governments win, they usually win early. Likewise, when rebels win, they too win early. What are the prospects for insurgent victory in Iraq? In Iraq, the opportunity for rebel victory was especially ripe during the early days of the war, because the government itself was not only weak, but newly installed by foreign power in the aftermath of a military invasion. From April 2003, when the Hussein regime was toppled, until June 2004, When the Iraqi Provisional Authority formally transferred governing authority to the interim government of Iraq, Iraq was governed by a foreign occupation force. A coherent insurgency, had there been one, had perhaps its best chance of victory then. It did not. The second possibility would be for the insurgents to wait out the occupying force, and once the U.S. withdraws all of its forces, escalate armed conflict in an effort to overthrow the regime in both either Iraq or Afghanistan, a regime weakened by the U.S. departure and lacking the institutional capacity or the popular legitimacy to defeat a revived insurgency. That possibility still exists in both nations. The prospects for the government defeating the insurgents in both nations are rather slim. The best chances there was also early on. Rebel movements in all cases start off with a distinct disadvantage. They must build a rebel army from scratch in the shadow of a government that already has an established military. In Iraq, once the insurgency emerged, the prospects for an early government victory were reduced by the fact that the nation was governed by a force of foreign occupation. There was no Iraqi government. The government installed by the U.S. Lacked the military capacity to subdue the insurgency and the political legitimacy to mobilize popular support against the insurgents. Nor was it an especially effective governing authority in terms of delivering basic public services and security from armed violence. The Iraqi insurgency had the further advantage of being able to recruit from among thousands of former Iraqi soldiers and former Ba'ath Party members who had been cashiered by the Iraqi Provisional Authority in 2003. If decisive victory is unlikely in either case, what's the other alternative? Well, what our research shows is that the most likely outcome after 10 years of war is some sort of negotiated settlement. That may be the best we can hope for. Once a civil war settles into a stalemate, the most likely outcome, if the conflict is to be brought to an end at all, is a negotiated settlement. This is the one outcome that is not discussed that much in public debate, yet it may be, according to the research we've done, our most viable policy option. Since the end of the Cold War, well, the one reason that it is probably not discussed as much is there's the perception that peace created through negotiated settlement is not a very lasting peace. Negotiated settlements tend to break down, and for much of the post-World War II era, that was the case. Negotiated settlements did produce a less durable peace than decisive military victory, but once military victory becomes less likely, it's the best remaining option. Moreover, since the end of the Cold War, negotiated settlements have become more durable. Of the 7 conflicts that ended with a peace agreement between 2000 and 2003, only 1 restarted in less than 5 years. By contrast, 2 out of the 3 military victories, supposedly the most stable termination form, failed during the same 3-year period. How then do you create a durable settlement? Well, 2 things. First, a well-designed peace agreement. What does a well-designed peace agreement involve? First, multiple dimensions of power sharing, political, military, territorial, and economic. And secondly, robust implementation. In many cases, what this involves is some sort of multinational peace-building mission to supervise the disarming, demobilizing, and reintegration of the hostile forces back into society, to assist in the establishment of government institutions of a post-war regime that can deliver basic government services and establish the rule of law, and to assist in elections of a post-war government, including setting up the machinery of elections, oversight of the elections, and counting the votes. These findings on the prospects for ending civil wars are rather robust, and they suggest that our public discussions on what to do in these 2 cases, whether to increase troops or withdraw them, those decisions should be calibrated on whether reductions or increases in troops will enhance the prospects for achieving a negotiated settlement. Thank you.